Welcome back to the second part of our discussion on COVID-19 in our series, Having the Mind of Christ in 2020. Once again, we're joined by our panel, Dr. Dan Doriani, Dr. Jay Whippold, and Tommy Hanna, along with myself.
So if I could just comment, I'll say it in my terms. Science is always fact-driven, it's always data-driven, it's observation-driven. So there's observational error. There are errors of understanding or drawing deductions from the observations. But even if those first two are perfect, even if there's no observational error, no error in deductions or induction, there's still a possibility that new facts will come to light. Mm-hmm. And so we're still discovering occasionally new subatomic particles that make people have to rethink physics. And my favorite is, physics was all figured out about 50 years ago. And now, something like 75 to 95% of the universe is dark matter. And we call it that because we can't perceive it at all. And we just draw it as an inference from calculations that don't work unless we say, well, there must be something we're not perceiving. And someday somebody's going to figure out what dark matter is, and they're going to chuckle at those poor folks who didn't know what to make of dark matter. And that doesn't mean they're incompetent. It doesn't mean they made any mistakes at all. It means they were finite. And they just didn't have enough data. Now, they might be incompetent, but even the most competent scientist, by definition, is not working with absolute truth. It's with incremental truth.
So as we think about our topic, COVID-19, it's safe to assume we'll probably know more about it next year than we do today. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, we have to take action today because almost 200,000 people have died. Mm-hmm. Now, in saying that, I quickly hear critics who say, well, those numbers have been massaged. Mm-hmm. They are including a lot of deaths that probably weren't actually caused by COVID-19 or were tangentially caused by COVID-19, but really were the result of a number of other health factors. What do we do when it's not just the science that isn't 100% foolproof, it's also the messaging that we get. As we're trying to cooperate as a society, but people have private interests. We're trying to get funding for our hospital, or we're trying to win an election, or whatever their motive may be. How do we live as Christians in a world where we don't even know who to believe or what to believe?
You're looking at me, but I feel like I've talked lately.
Tommy, you got any thoughts on that one?
Yeah. I mean, the narrative that this is maybe just, certain hospitals attempting to get funding, or that it's even, a political move to either affect or adjust future elections, or even to push certain parties' agendas, isn't seeing that those things, whether they're true or not, are secondary to the fact that there is a global crisis. And so while we live in a state of degree of plausibility, certainly, and we don't have absolute assurance of knowing exactly what is the best response to this virus, there does seem to be a degree of unity in other countries that America has shown to be wanting. And I guess I wonder more than anything, in this age of anxiety, where people really want black and white. People don't want to hear there's a degree of plausibility here with masks. People want to hear, is it right or is it wrong? Is it good for me or is it bad for me? And there's no simple answer, except for individually, when we come across people who have strong opinions, walking in humility alongside them and hearing them. Because underneath every opinion, there are intuitions, as Jonathan Haidt would say. And the rationalizing that happens for those views are ultimately led to some degree or another by some internal drive for comfort, security, there are other reasons as well. And intuition can be challenged. But that thing intuition is challenged through intentional relationship, where we walk patiently with people.
So Ben, as a pastor to Pal, I'll take off the, epistemological hat for a second and speak pastorally. I'm guessing if people are watching, they're saying, are these people ever going to tell us what to do? Are they just going to quote possibilities and problems? So I'm going to try to help you out a little bit and say that in biblical ethics, we talk about the principle of caution. And it comes from things like, don't dig a pit, the Bible says, because somebody might fall in it. Well, they probably won't, but they might. And if you have a bull that's a little bit dangerous, you need to pen it up because it might kill somebody. Well, it probably won't, but it might. And so from those sorts of teachings, we get the principle of caution. And I have a daughter who is, at this moment, 10 days from her due date. And we've had multiple conversations about COVID and what happens when the baby's born. Will I be able to hold the baby? And I said, listen, if you tell me I can't hold my granddaughter, I will be very sad, but I will totally respect you. I won't question you at all, because we don't know what happens. There's very little, indication that babies get sick, but we don't know. And a few babies have died, and they do happen to be minorities more, which we have to examine ourselves on. But if you want me not to touch your baby, my granddaughter, I won't. Furthermore, I'm not flying anywhere until the baby's born, under any circumstances. I'm not sure if planes are safe or not. I've read studies that they're very safe, and I've read studies that they're not safe. So I'm not going to risk my granddaughter's health and my daughter's wishes. I was in a meeting just yesterday, and and somebody said, hey, Dan, good to see you. They stuck out the hand, and I stuck out my elbow. And I said, hey, and it's a very convenient excuse, but it's true. I said, my daughter's giving birth in a few days, and she lives here, and so, she's asked me to really stay clean because I want to hold the grandbaby. Now, that's a true statement. And I avoided offense by pointing out a life situation. But I think we all have to find our way to avoid offense when somebody wants to give us a hug. And you think, I love you, but I don't want a hug right now. And to find your way to gently say, if you're anxious and not without reason, if you're anxious about getting sick, find your way to say, excuse me, I love you, but I'd like to be careful right now of my health, and so we'll just touch elbows or something like that instead of making contact. Or do you mind keeping it 6 feet? I'm worried about getting infected. And it helps to practice so that you can say what you need to say. And if you're a little bit more loose, you're 35 and you're full of life, and you could lose your sense of smell for 5 days and you don't care. Then of course it's love your neighbors yourself, because there are a lot of people who are concerned. And I would just say, if you're the kind of person that wants to shake hands, just think twice if that's a good way to love your neighbor. So to give very practical advice, the principle of caution urges us not to take unnecessary risks. I personally hate masks. They make me claustrophobic, and when I talk a lot, then I suck in and I can't get any air, and I really don't like that. But when I'm in public, and by the way, we're a little bit more than 6 feet apart, I'm going to wear a mask for the sake of the people around me, and for my own sake.
And it's fairly easy in the sense that people will always respect when you say, I am actively trying to protect a member of my family who's about to be born. Yes. Nobody's going to argue with that.
Right.
But to carry that argument over to say, and actually I value every human being as much as my grandchild that's about to be born.
Right.
For some folks, that might be harder to say. I did hear a story recently, just a friend of a friend, this happened to them. They were having a conversation about why people, sometimes you see them wearing their masks in their car. Like nobody's in there with you. You're not a threat to anybody but yourself,
Yeah.
and you're breathing your own air with or without your mask. And so they were talking about this, and there was the friend's daughter was sitting nearby and spoke up and said, when I see somebody drive by in their car wearing a mask and nobody else is in the car with them, it just makes me think how afraid they must be.
Yeah.
And not everybody that wears a mask in their car is afraid, of course. Sometimes people have to wear them all day at work and they literally forget that it's on, or maybe they're just, maybe there's somebody else in the car you can't see, who knows. But it was a sentiment. It was an awareness of concern for other people's, not only their health, but back to Tommy's point, their degree of needing to be understood in a way that may not be where you are emotionally on this whole topic. Now, what gets really tricky, of course, is when we start to perceive that the government is deciding how we should feel and what we should do. I think something I hear people wondering about is, what do we do when we become concerned that government regulations aren't aligning with actually what is the best human expertise available, or what is healthiest for our well-being? Let's pivot and talk about that for a second. How is there some space that we can live between kind of blind, just willingness to follow the government's dictums anywhere it goes, and kind of this hunger for rebellion? I can't wait for the government to do something that I feel steps on my toes, so I can really stand up and let everybody know that I'm an independent, autonomous thinker. Where is the gracious place to live between those two?
Well, I think we're seeing that this week in the parents of student athletes who are protesting Dr. Sam Page for his ruling that they cannot participate in sports. I'm not going to say whether or not it's the right way to do it or anything, but I think it's emblematic of a, at least up to this point, a free society in which people can express concern about the way decisions were made. Now, it's a matter of persuasion. Can Dr. Page persuade the protesters he did this with their best interests and that this is the best thing to do? The protester would like to persuade Dr. Page to maybe lighten up. And that's the to and fro we see in a free society.
So is it not wrong to try to persuade somebody else? It's a little bit of a trick question, right?
I mean, of course we can try to persuade other people, especially, there's one of the things we have to remember is that some people really do have more expertise than others. And so if a bright 14-year-old reads 4 articles on COVID and then makes a declaration, and our good doctor here happens to hear it, and everybody turns to Jay and says, with their eyes, would you please weigh in? We've heard the 14-year-old, and now we would like you to speak. And there is a place for expertise. And if you have expertise, you should use it. Now, Dr. Page, we may disagree with Dr. Page, but he is a physician, right? And so at least he can understand the literature. We'd have to give him that much credit. So I have no problem persuading. The problem with the question is Romans 14,
Right.
despising, condemning, belittling, tearing apart the fabric of your group of friends. If maybe unchurched people shouldn't tear friendships apart. Certainly in the church, unity, love, forbearance, putting others first are cardinal marks of Christian community. So we always have to ask, is this a primary or a secondary? Now, there are a few parents who say, I'm convinced my son or daughter is going to be a professional athlete. And, they do things like move to other states so they can play. But most people would say this is a secondary, maybe a very deeply held secondary, but it's a secondary, and therefore we should yield. I'm happy. I know we want to talk about what do you do when the government gets onerous, not about secondary but primary. But I think this is a case where you have to say, Romans 13, respect the governing authorities and pray for them and submit to them. That is to say, yield to their position, their God-given position. There's more to be said, but that's a first thought anyway.
So do you have a thought, Tommy?
I also, total agreement. And I'm thinking about John MacArthur's church right now. Have you guys followed that at all?
Out in California, yeah.
Yeah, in California. And they're considering their time of worship to be a protest against the fact that churches are shut down and not allowed to worship together, but people are allowed to protest in the streets. 6% of these protests turn out to be violent, and nothing is done about that. And quite a few people are very upset about that, as we all are aware. And I don't think that is the way that Christians should go about protesting their government authorities, but I do think that there is a point to be made, that there is some preference being given towards societal issues today, and that issues on liberty and fairness are being triggered all around. And that, I'm thinking about John MacArthur and various Christians' decision to continue to go to church during this time, not in a way that's honoring to government authorities, but in a way that is, if what we know about COVID to be, within the degree of plausibility that it is, and to the danger that it seems to be dangerous to one another, then where should we stand on that? How do we look at other Christians who are deciding to go against the government, and when we approach them, how do we do that in a way that leads them back to respecting authorities in this difficult time of, we're in a democracy, we're not under a dictatorship, we're not in a monarchy.
And
that's the sign I'm struggling with.
It does seem that key component of having the right to try to persuade others is what sets us apart. And the reason that I was saying it's a trick question is because you can go about the art of persuasion in a very effective way, and we could call that very Christian. Mm-hmm. You can also do it in a very non-Christian way. So is it right and good to try to persuade? Well, it depends on how you do it. Mm-hmm. One of the, I've seen on social media, for example, somebody wearing a T-shirt with a big smile on their face that said hashtag anybody but Sam Page. Mm-hmm. Now we could debate, is that an effort at effective and fair persuasion, or is that maybe fallen into the spirit that violates what you've talked to us about Romans? That's where, those kind of instances are where we really get down into bringing our ethics into our momentary, moment-by-moment decisions.
So there's no question that we have every right to protest inequitable decisions. That's what you're talking about. And in California, which is, not a state known for being part of the Bible Belt, it probably shouldn't be a surprise. The governments want to be popular. Sam Page, I have to give him this credit for this. He's not aiming for popularity. He's aiming for principle. And even if you think he's wrong, I want a governor who doesn't follow the wind. So let's give him that at least. California looks like they're following the wind, and so 20,000 people can gather in very close quarters if it's a socially approved cause, which is protest of injustice. And I'm not against protesting injustice. But then a church can't gather even if every other pew is marked off. And we have every right. In fact, we ought to point out that that's inequitable. But I do think we need to hold our fire for true civil disobedience for those times when it is necessary. And it's very clear from Acts chapter 4 and chapter 5, where the apostles are commanded by the authorities to stop preaching about Jesus. Stop saying that we put him to death and that he rose again, and we're going to put you in jail again. And they go, well, here's our problem. You did put him to death, and he did rise again. And he commanded us to teach this. And so you decide for yourself if we should listen to you or God. But our view is clear. We're going to listen to God if there's a flat contradiction. If you're commanding us to do something evil or forbidding us to do something that's the only way to follow God. Now, of course, today, and I'm not trying to pass judgment on MacArthur, who's a great man of God. He made his decision for his reasons. But today, here at our church and many other churches, we have 3 worship services on Sunday, and we have, most of our people are in church. We have an outdoor service, and an indoor service, and you can watch at home. So we're not being thwarted. We're not being forbidden. It's inconvenient because we have to work harder and set up chairs, and, everybody's working harder. Mm-hmm. But nobody's saying you can't worship, and nobody's saying you can't worship publicly. So we have to hold, you might say, our strongest act, which is civil disobedience, for those moments when it's imperative, not when it's attractive.
Well, we are going to, as we get closer to the presidential election in November, we're going to have a couple more of these sessions specifically devoted to politics and how to think about them and engage them as Christians. Let me ask 1 or 2 more questions back specifically on COVID-19. Jay, how is this going to come to an end? We have heard questions, we've heard a lot of banter and claims about a vaccine. Sometimes we hear talk about the possibility of herd immunity solving everything. What is your read as a very experienced and accomplished physician in how this whole thing is going to end, and in the meantime, how we need to be doing our part to help it end?
Well, I wish I could say it's going to end. Mm-hmm. I don't have a crystal ball, but we do know a couple of things just based on our past history and medical science, and that is pandemics in the world of, global travel and so forth are coming up about once every 10 years. What has been very unusual about this one was the decision of governments to shut down economies. Mm. So I want to put that aside for a moment and just try to deal with the medical. Okay. So I think we can say that pandemics will probably be with us for a long time, probably coming in periods of hopefully no more than 10 years or less than 10 years, but we can't say. As we begin to push out into areas that have wildlife and so forth, we're going to come in contact with animals and so forth. As populations become denser, particularly in underdeveloped parts of the world where sanitation may not be quite what we would desire, we will probably see pandemics. I think it is fair to say that these pandemics are not necessarily going to be respiratory, although certainly that is going to be very high on one's list. But Ebola, for example, was not respiratory. And so, we will see things that may not fit the template. Now, after that gloom and doom, how about COVID? Well, I think that certainly many groups are working very hard on a vaccine. I think we need to understand that the vaccine may not give 100% immunity. Not everyone may take that vaccine. The vaccine may only work for a while. And so to say that a vaccine will suddenly switch the clock back to 2018 is probably that's not going to happen. We've never developed an effective corona vaccine. Now, we are closer, I think, on this one because some of the methodologies now are beginning to be perfected, and aiming at the spike proteins and so forth seems to be an effective strategy. But will that come in October, November? I don't know. I suspect some form of vaccine will come. Whether or not it's going to be effective to dial the clock back, I can't answer. Same with herd immunity. Most people are aware there are two ways to get herd immunity. You get a large population that gets the virus, they survive, you have the equivalent of a chickenpox party, and then all the kids are fine.
And then 40 years later, they get shingles.
Yes.
Which nobody foresaw.
Right.
Learning.
Yeah.
Or even the movement disorders, the neo-Parkinsonism that came after the 1918 flu. No one knew about that.
Yeah.
And by the way, there may be things down the pike even with COVID. It's now looking like COVID may be more of a capillary blood vessel virus than a respiratory virus. But the other way to get herd immunity is by the vaccine. And we don't know what the percent would be. Other viruses, typically 60 to 70% of a population that have either had it or have had vaccination to protect the others, because there's not enough people for the virus to spread. So I suspect, number one, we'll probably get a vaccine at some point, but we don't know when. Number two, it probably won't be the panacea, that it will cure everyone and that will go on life as before. Number three is probably COVID will continue to mutate. Our experience has shown that mutations generally make it less virulent. It will probably fade into the fabric of seasonal flus and so forth and so on. Total fatalities may be a little higher overall with it included in the statistics. And I think the key will be, how will we psychologically adjust? How will we spiritually adjust? How will we deal with the uncertainty of life since the fall, where death and danger have always been with us? We cannot inoculate society from all risk. How will we deal with that in a risk-averse culture and society? We can't lock down when someone sneezes in Hong Kong. We've already shown that sort of a solution, number one, may not even be effective. I mean, there's some information that the lockdown per se may not have really dampened the overall burden, maybe stretched it out, but the burden is still there. So I think that's the question. How will we deal with it spiritually? How will we deal with it psychologically to just move on? Because I do think COVID or some of its cousins will probably be with us in the near and intermediate future.
With that in mind, let me ask one last question, but I'd love for each of you to answer it. And it's simply this: what gives you hope right now? As we continue to endure this discouraging, long, drawn-out interruption that may well, in some sense, be a permanent interruption to life as we once remember it. What gives you the ability to endure, to wake up every morning and say, I can live my life well to the glory of Christ today? And even beyond enduring, what allows you to go ahead and have joy in your life right now?
Well, for me, this is the gospel moment.
Yeah.
This is when I rejoice that the Holy Spirit has given me the faith, imperfect as it is, that I have. This summer I've been doing a study on the minor prophets, and it's a very, very instructive read to go through the minor prophets and to see what they were facing in terms of upheaval and disruption, the hand of the Assyrians, the Babylonians. And they end their books usually with a praise that God is their God and He will sustain them. This is the great gospel moment, I think, that the church has with the hurt and the need of people out there. The lady wearing the mask in the car who is probably indeed afraid. This is the gospel moment that the church has. That's what buoys me up.
Good. Thanks, Jay. Dan, Tommy?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a similar answer for all of us to one degree or another, but that this is a time in which we get to rest and rejoice in the sovereignty of God. We live in a fallen age that is not permanent. Mm-hmm. This is a season. Mm-hmm. And even the fall itself is a season that will one day be washed over by the kingdom of God. And so I think about how in this season, and even in most seasons where life is more difficult, the gospel continues to spread in spite of, and often, I mean, it almost appears because of the difficulties in life. Mm-hmm. And so this is a great opportunity it's a gospel moment for the kingdom of God to look spectacular to people in great need. And so this is a huge opportunity for the church.
Hope indeed. Dan?
Yeah, so
How would you put it?
the first thing I would say is it just makes it clear where our hope is not. And, I love everything that Jay says about vaccines and getting back to normal and science curing everything. This shows that our government is flawed. And as we've said, most government folk are doing their best. Some are probably trying to exploit this for their own purposes, but most are probably doing their best. But every government has made mistakes. And by the way, every church has made mistakes, and every business manager has made mistakes, and there's no human science, medicine, government that's going to work our way out of here. So where do we look? And I view this as an interesting moment. I'm interested in what will happen for the next couple of years as we try to use this assurance. I feel like my first thought is, look, I already knew I was going to die. But I may possibly die a little earlier than I thought. And people were more responsive to the gospel in times when life was shorter, it seems. And, if you lived any time up till 1930 or 40 or 50, you had a really good chance of dying before you were 40. And we have this sort of, well, I'm going to live to be 80, especially if I don't smoke and I don't drink and drive, and I'll be fine. And by the time I'm 80, I'll be worn out, and I'll be ready to go. And this does remind us of our mortality. It's almost, we're thankful it's not as bad as the Black Death and various other plagues in the past. And we have to be delicate because so see COVID, you're going to die, so you need Jesus. I mean, you can't probably draw the line that directly, but I'm hopeful for God's purposes, God's sovereign purposes in this. If you ask me what gives me hope, I'm going to give a very honest answer before I give the correct answer. My wife, my children, my grandchildren, my friends give me hope. I mean, life is still good. I mean, God's given me so many blessings, as Jay said. Forget not his benefits. They're still there. I mean, having to wear a mask isn't all that bad. I still have a wonderful wife and children and friends. What more could I want in life? And then, of course, as we've said, the gospel is the solution to death. There is going to be a renewed heavens and a renewed earth. And we've already been handed the solution to the problem of death. And as believers, we've embraced that, and we want to share that with others. And this is a time to hold that dear and to believe it, shall we say, with a little more intensity than maybe in times past.
Well said. Thank you to each of you. Of course, our theology is our foundation. I will say, I do take personally some hope in our medical community. If there was ever a time in history that I would want to have to go through COVID, it's definitely now.
Right.
And the work of our scientists and our physicians is absolutely phenomenal. And I'm grateful for all of the earnest hard work that's being done by you and your colleagues, Jay. But it is hard but necessary to be reminded, no matter how good they get, we are going to pass one day. And that the question of what happens then is really the final question. And to have not a politician, but a priest, a savior that has already promised us what will come if we trust in him is it's what I need. And I thank you guys for reminding me of it this evening and for participating in this discussion. And let's do it again soon. Well, thank you for joining us in our discussion on COVID-19 in our series, Having the Mind of Christ in 2020. I hope you found this edifying and useful to you as you continue to know God better in this real world that we live. And we look forward to seeing you with our next installment in this series next week. Thank you.